Warning: the following podcast might be too truthful for most liberals. Listener discretion is therefore advised.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. This is your host, Mark Galar. I am very excited to have today a guest who spent 33 years with the FBI. In fact, he was the first FBI agent on the scene during the attempted Reagan assassination. He's had a very storied career at the FBI. He's here today to talk to us about a book he's written entitled The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Mr. Baker, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Mark.
One of the things you refer back to frequently in the book is that the FBI has a culture problem that began with Mueller when he was head of the FBI. And you also point out that the current head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, really doesn't get it. He seems to think it's just a matter of weeding out a few bad apples and doesn't really seem to understand that there's a culture problem. Could you begin by telling us what that culture problem is, when exactly it began, and what we need to do about it?
Okay, Mark. Well, the FBI, although they had a counterintelligence mission almost from the beginning, always had the culture of a law enforcement agency. That is an agency that operated, for the most part, within the guide rails of the Constitution. Where things started to go off the track, I believe, was shortly after the September 11th attacks. Those horrible attacks took place on a Tuesday, September 11th. The director of the FBI at that time was Robert Mueller. That's Bob Mueller of special counsel fame. He had only been the FBI director for 2 or 3 days when the attacks happened. On the Saturday morning following the attacks, he was summoned to a meeting at Camp David, Maryland, with the president, George W. Bush. So 3.5 days had elapsed between the actual attacks and that Saturday morning. And in those 3.5 days, the FBI had done what it does best: investigate. And in that short period of time, they identified all 19 hijackers, their financing, their travel, their associates, their contacts going back to Al-Qaeda. And when he was done presenting this report in Camp David, George W. Bush just turned to Mueller and said, "I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." Mueller was humiliated, and he set out, he said this many times, he was bound and determined after that encounter to change the culture of the FBI. And that's the word he used, from that of a law enforcement organization to an intelligence agency. To some people, that may have been justified at that moment in history, but unfortunately, it had unintended consequences, which were bad.
Well, tell us what some of those consequences are and how that has manifested itself in some of the more recent cases.
Okay, well, the underlying cultural change is this. In a law enforcement agency, you exist, you focus, you work every day, consciously or unconsciously, for when the day comes that you have to raise your hand in a courtroom and swear before a judge or a jury to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So that informs your mindset. In an intelligence agency, you don't deal in the truth. An intelligence agency operates day to day through deceit and deception. Their ultimate product is an estimate, what they call an intelligence estimate. Some would call it a best guess, and guesses aren't allowed in the courtroom. So when you have an organization that changes its mindset to intelligence gathering rather than evidence gathering, that has a lot of consequences. That's the cultural change we're talking about. And all of the problems of the last half dozen years that have become manifest trace back to that. Now, also, you have the phenomenon there were some very practical and specific changes Mueller introduced in changing the culture that were then exacerbated by the poor leadership of James Comey. For instance, in the FBI, investigations were always run from the field. So you had a field agent, a case agent who was responsible for the investigation. He was closely supervised by his field supervisor. Then there was the agent in charge of that field office, oversaw them both. And only ultimately after that was their supervision, program supervision from FBI headquarters. Mueller changed that with the investigation of the September 11th attacks, which the Bureau codenamed Pent Bomb. And then that continued under Comey for the Hillary Clinton investigation and then the Russian collusion investigation, Crossfire Hurricane. The result being layers of independent judgment and independent review were eliminated. So you had the catastrophe in Crossfire Hurricane, the Russian collusion investigation, of the same individuals making the decisions as who were carrying out the investigation. For instance, Peter Strzok, a deputy assistant director, rather high-ranking individual, opened the investigation, composed the communication opening the investigation, signed it out on a Sunday, July 31st, 2016, and the following day, on Monday, he traveled to London, England to conduct the first interview in that investigation. It was bound to end badly.
When you talk about Peter Strzok, one of the things you mention in the book are the numerous text messages between himself and, frankly, his lover, Lisa Page. You talk about the fact that they wanted to get Trump. There was incredibly profane language being used, and that kind of spoke to the fall in culture at the FBI. So my question for you is, when you look at this fall in culture, you talk about arrogance, you talk about apathy, say in the case of the doctor for the U.S. gymnastics team, and again, you talk about the horrible, disgusting language being used between FBI agents. Do you think this is merely something with the FBI, or is it just part of a cultural shift for all of society? I mean, it seems like all of our society is more profane, more apathetic, doesn't care if people don't care if they do a good job. So how much of this is just FBI and how much of it is part of our larger societal culture? And if it's part of our larger societal culture, can we really do anything about it?
Well, Mark, you've just pointed out something that numerous others have pointed out to me, including current FBI employees and current FBI executives. Some of the specific things in the way cases are managed and the intelligence approach to work rather than the law and order approach are very specific to the FBI and contributes to the errors we have seen. But sadly, I think you're onto something. Part of this is the new generation of employees are being recruited from a pool of woke, recent college, law school, graduate school graduates, and a person, specifically Bill Barr, 2 or 3 months ago, speaking to a conference set up by the National Review magazine, he specifically pointed to that it's society-wide, the recruitment problem. The FBI and the Department of Justice have to do something specifically about their problem. But sadly, a lot of this comes from the pool of individuals we're recruiting from, and it's manifest in some of the communications, the language that's being used. And by the language, I don't just mean the bad language. The terms of reference which came to light, for instance, in the memos that were targeting what they call traditional radical Catholics, we'd say just people who prefer to worship in Latin. The language they're using there, a lot of that language, Bill Barr identified this, was the language of the woke culture. So sadly, yes, it is a problem that goes beyond the FBI, but there are specific things relating to the FBI that should and can be addressed by current management.
And can you tell us what some of those things are? I know you'd like to see the field agents be more in charge than the headquarters, but what else can the FBI do to change its culture? back to what it was when the FBI was respected by everyone?
Well, the case management, that is one. That's with specificity. The other thing is the training and the attitude. When I was a new agent, and for decades, when we were in training as agents, a lot of the time was spent on the U.S. Constitution, the time in the classroom. And we were taught the Constitution was to be the guiding light, and that was under past directors. It was very firm. We even had one legal instructor, I recall, that gave each of us at the end of our training a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution to keep in our pocket. And he told us that if you keep the Constitution with you in your breast pocket, when you're sitting down and interviewing a citizen, or when you're searching somebody's home, if you have the Constitution in your pocket, you won't go wrong, you won't go off the track. Now, that sounds corny to some people, but in fact, a lot of us followed that, and we did keep the Constitution close to us. So that's one guideline, that's grounding the training in the Constitution. Since Mueller's change in the FBI, a new cadre of employees have arisen in the FBI, intelligence analysts. And they're people, as the name implies, they're in the office, they analyze intelligence. They're not out in the field interacting with citizens in ways that directly affect their liberty like special agents are. But they're rather freewheeling in their thinking. And these are some of these woke individuals that produce these intelligence products like the targeting of traditional Catholics. That's something that just doesn't fit in a police agency, which is what the FBI does. And a lot of FBI executives, past and present, have said that importing what is essentially, and it was manifest as this, the CIA model of an intelligence analyst who's free to think and conceive of different ideas, importing that into an agency with police power just doesn't work. And that has led to some of the very specific recent problems.
Let's talk about some of the specific cases that the FBI has perhaps not done as well on as they should have. You mentioned in the book Dr. Larry Nassar, the doctor who was the official doctor for the U.S. gymnastics team, and how he molested over 200 young women. And when that case was brought to the FBI, they took forever to act on it. They did some interviews. It took them, 17 months to even do the 302 forms that they're supposed to do when they conduct an interview, and seemed rather apathetic about the entire case. I take it that's not something that would have happened when you were with the FBI.
No, and I do mention that case in the book is symptomatic. There were a whole series of cases actually came to light in that same summer of 2021, I believe. That was symptomatic. You mentioned just the slipshod manner and the lack of supervision in that case, going all the way up to the agent in charge of the Indianapolis office at the time, and taking down a victim, a witness, a subject's information. There was a firm rule in the FBI, the rule still exists, that this material has to be written up in the form you mentioned it, FD 302, within 5 days. Turns out in that case, one of the key testimony, a young woman, came forward with her complaints with specificity. She was a victim. Her complaint was not written up for 17 months. That's beyond the pale. That one particular agent was dismissed, I believe, fired. His supervisor, the agent in charge, retired in time to miss being dismissed, but the two agents are gone. And that case, too, like others that have happened in the past couple of years, when the current FBI management is presented with these issues, every single time, Chris Wray has either said to Congress or said in a public statement, or said when he's talking to groups of former agents, well, we got rid of the bad apples. They're gone. And that's true. The two main miscreants of the Nassar case are both gone. And you could say the same thing about the Governor Whitmer kidnapping. 2 or 3 agents were either fired or allowed to walk out the door. in the beginning, the laptop case, the ASAC in Washington Field who tried to deep six that matter, he was allowed to walk out the door on a Friday. And in so many of these cases, the individual miscreants are gone. In fact, the biggest one of all, of course, that we had John Durham, the special counsel, did a post-mortem on the Crossfire Hurricane. That's the FBI code name for the Russian collusion investigation. John Durham documented the bias and the errors and the lack of evidence that in that investigation, a major investigation that dragged on for several years. And in that case, and in his response to it, Chris Wray simply said, well, they're all gone. They're up to and including James Comey, Andrew McCabe, the deputy director, Peter Strzok, who we mentioned earlier, and a couple of others. They're all gone. And instead of looking at why is this continuing to happen, what's the underlying problem? And the underlying problem is the culture of an intelligence agency, and Wray still uses Mueller's term. He wants it to be an intelligence-driven organization. And rather than restoring it to a swear to tell the truth, go by the rule book, law enforcement organization, that's what has to happen. The culture has to be changed.
We have to take a short break, but we will be right back after these messages. Let's go back and look at some of these cases that you just referenced. We talk about the Governor Gretchen Whitmire kidnapping case. You mentioned in the book, in that particular case, there were almost more agents involved than actual suspects. And I'm just curious, what is your opinion on this case with regard to whether or not there was some entrapment going on? Because just 2 days ago, the last 3 defendants in that case were acquitted, and based on what you wrote about the case in your book, I'm going to guess you're not surprised.
Well, I wasn't surprised by that. If we can step back a second, and what I do in the book, by the way, and as you've obviously read the book, you're very familiar with it, but a sub-theme in the book, The Fall of the FBI, a sub-theme is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I try to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly being these recent cultural missteps. But along the way in FBI history, and I was somewhat involved in this at the time, we had a major development, the Abscam case, which was rather historic and was later made into a movie, American Hustle, which won several Academy Awards. And in the Abscam case, the FBI had set up an undercover operation and gathered evidence of a lot of public corruption and a lot of financial crime. And ultimately, 1 U.S. senator and 6 members of Congress were convicted in that case. It was rather earth-shaking in the early 80s. Now, one of the defenses that the accused raised in that case, and it didn't hold water in that case, but they raised it, and people in Congress and the media raised it, was entrapment. And as a result of that case, the Bureau enacted under Judge William Webster initially, and later his successors like Louis Freeh, very stringent training about entrapment. And basically it came down to, in these undercover approaches, that you couldn't do anything to people who are, quote unquote, not otherwise inclined to commit these crimes. In other words, you couldn't plant the idea in their head and then supply them the means of carrying out the crime. They had to demonstrate a mentality that they were inclined to commit these crimes themselves. So this very strict training went on for decades. And the defense of entrapment was never seriously raised in a major Bureau case until the Governor Whitmer case. Now, did it hold sway? It certainly came up in the federal case of the previous defendants, some of whom were acquitted, 1 or 2 who were convicted. But when you look at the case and everything that was dragged out in court, it really was an absolute disgrace. And ultimately, in that case, 2 agents at least were fired for their behavior in that case. And you had a viable argument on the part of the defense for entrapment because the texts, the documents, the conversations, the recordings are all there, where you have either the undercover agents or more often the informants in the group inspiring, encouraging the others to commit these crimes. And you had I forget the exact number actually, but you had quite a few informants and quite a few undercover agents in amongst this group of men. And really, it was a crackpot idea. Nobody's trying to defend the idea. And some of them were convicted who took overt steps towards either kidnapping, or they even talked about bombing the governor's residence. So what we have there is just this overreach. And entrapment was raised as a viable defense for the first time in decades in an FBI case. It should have never happened. Once again, when Christopher Wray is questioned about this and other Bureau officials, they point to the fact that they fired 2 agents involved. One was the original case agent, another was an agent very heavily involved in handling the informants in the case. They did fire them, but that doesn't address, once again, the underlying problem when you look at, and I go into some detail for several pages in the book, the behavior of these people and what the hell was wrong with their supervisors, that both of them had outside employment. One of them had a violent personality. He was actually arrested by local authorities for beating his wife. It was just a terrible situation.
It certainly sounds like it. I think you mentioned that one of them also was involved with a CrossFit business, and the whole idea of FBI agents having a little job on the side, I find very, very troubling, to be honest with you.
Well, it's flat out against the rules. The one guy ran this CrossFit business, and he was it turns out, rather open about it. His supervisors should have stopped that. The other guy ran a private investigative service, which is a direct, in direct conflict with his own work. And he put out online, and this is documented on Facebook and elsewhere, claiming credit for his company for the work the FBI in the Detroit division were doing in other terrorist-related matters. It was just, but they were both fired, as they should have been, but they should have never been allowed to get to that point. But there were so many undercover agents and informants involved in this case. That's what allowed the defense to raise the issue of entrapment. And it reminded me of the story we all heard years ago. We used to hear this, that way back in the 50s and the 60s, when one of the major targets of the FBI was the Communist Party USA, the domestic Communist Party in this country, that it got to the point after several decades that there were so many informants in the Communist Party that the Communist Party USA, that it was only the dues paid to the Communist Party by the informants, which was essentially government money, that was keeping the CPUSA alive. It was sort of a joke, but it was also a criticism. And of course, what's not very funny is that, I mean, in the Whitmer case, a couple of the early defendants who were acquitted, 2 of them at least, I believe, were kept in jail for 18 months. So here's 2 ultimately acquitted individuals who spent 18 months in jail. I mean, that's, we're talking about violations of people's civil liberties here.
Yeah, there's some very similar stuff going on with J6 detainees in Washington. It's very sad. Some of these people, I think, are going to end up doing a lot more time just by the time they waited for their quote-unquote speedy trial. But let me get back to some of these other cases. The Hillary Clinton emails, you described that as a case where James Comey, usurped prosecutorial authority. Talk to us about that a little bit. What are your thoughts on it?
Okay, well, James Comey's poor leadership of the FBI exacerbated the cultural problems that Bob Mueller had created. And Comey manifests himself to be a very arrogant, self-righteous individual, and he usurped the role of the prosecutors, the U.S. attorney, or ultimately the attorney general, when he went on national television and essentially declined prosecution in the Hillary Clinton email case, saying no reasonable prosecutor would take this case. Well, that foreclosed it. That was not his role. He was out of order in doing that. he was out of order in the entire way he then later ran the Russian collusion investigation. But in both those cases, he followed the Mueller model. He brought the management back to headquarters. So you've eliminated layers of supervision and review, and the decisions in the Hillary Clinton case were all being made at FBI headquarters. The New York office in particular, and some of this did come out, these internal disagreements in the Bureau were arguing that this isn't the way it should be done and other things should be done. But James Comey never made any apology for his malign behavior. He wrote a book. In fact, now he's written several books, and he made quite a lot of money on his book. And at no time does he apologize for the damage he did to the FBI or the damage he did to our country. But what he does document in there very clearly is what was later shown in an official report by John Durham, that there was no reason, no probable cause, no predicate information to start the Russian collusion investigation. He has one paragraph in there, and he essentially says the Russian collusion investigation was started because of this one conversation. He references the conversation between Papadopoulos and another individual in London, England. Well, as Durham showed us, that was not enough reason to start an investigation of any U.S. person, much less a presidential campaign.
When I look at the Papadopoulos situation, I mean, first of all, he met with Miss Food, who told him that there was dirt that the Russians had on Hillary Clinton, and then a couple of weeks later, he's meeting with Downing from Australia, and he's, I guess, asked about that. He basically regurgitates what Miss Food had told him, and the next thing you know, this kid, who I believe was still in his late 20s or early 30s or something, found himself in a lot of trouble. But the whole thing just kind of reeked of a setup to me. Do you get similar vibes from that?
Well, yeah, that's the conversation that Comey cites in his book as the reason for starting Crossfire Hurricane investigation was Papadopoulos' conversation about quote unquote dirt on Hillary. And he repeated to an individual who was essentially the Australian ambassador to Britain that the Russians had dirt on Hillary. And he had heard this from this other individual. Well, it is so absurd, as John Durham points out, to base the opening of an investigation on that one conversation, an individual repeating what was already a secondhand rumor. If during election time, if you stood at any one of a dozen different bars or restaurants in the District of Columbia, like we have in a presidential election next year, if you stood around long enough, you'd hear dozens and dozens and dozens of rumors like this about any candidate you want to name. And a discussion about rumors about a candidate at a bar in election time I mean, there'd be thousands of investigations open if you use that as the thing. And in that particular thing, it was rather interesting. Hillary Clinton, in her earlier email thing she had lost, or the Russians and others, it was out there, had captured, thousands of her emails. And Papadopoulos relates this conversation, and you got this right on the information he heard from this other European academic there in England about the Russians having dirt on Hillary. 2 or 3 weeks later, Papadopoulos himself, as well as the man he was talking to, they both made the assumption that the dirt must be something in the emails, but he was never originally told that. That's maybe more details than people want to know, but it's just how these things get so out of hand.
One of the things I've been told by someone who was actually questioned by the Mueller team, Jerome Corsi, is that there is incredible pressure to lie so that these people can get to their ultimate target. I think they were using Corsi to get to Roger Stone so they could use Roger Stone to get to Donald Trump. But as you read through books written by people who were questioned by the Mueller team, it just seems that they were given a list of things to say, and it was sign this or sign this and all your problems will go away, or you can not sign it and you're going to probably end up spending the rest of your life in jail. Is that type of pressuring commonplace in the federal world, where you go up, you need somebody to say something, so you put charges against them that may or may not have validity, and then offer them a way out? I mean, is that something that's always gone on, or is that something particular the way Mueller's team did business?
There's two different things involved. Traditionally, in complex investigations and organized crime or financial matters, yes, you do try to get people lower down in the food chain who you're really not interested in prosecuting to become witnesses against people further up in the food chain. But what happened in the Mueller special counsel investigation that I think you're referencing, it became very clear to a lot of people early on, including agents who were assigned to it, who I've talked to, that this attitude that you just described, that they want to just get Trump and get the people around him, became overriding and really affected a lot of people's judgment. And there were 2 or 3 individuals by name who were identified with that attitude. Durham goes into that in his report a bit. It was just a get Trump attitude, and they didn't want to hear any exonerating information. Things should not be done that way. And when exculpatory information did come out on several of these characters, it was totally ignored. That's a disgrace. And the Inspector General also, in addition to Durham, the Department of Justice Inspector General, looked at aspects of this, including the FISA warrants that were used during the investigation. And he came to the same conclusion early on, that this is before we even knew that the Steele dossier was all a fabrication. Inspector General Horowitz came to the conclusion that they had, in getting the FISA warrants, had ignored exculpatory information. And that was throughout the Mueller investigation, that exculpatory information was ignored.
One of the cases that I'd like to get to, if you have time, is the Hunter Biden laptop case, a case where we had 51 intelligence agents come out and say that the Hunter Biden laptop story reeked of Russian disinformation. Now, at that point, I think the FBI had had Hunter's laptop for over a year. They knew full well it wasn't Russian disinformation, but not only did they allow these 51 agents to come forward and say this without challenging it, the FBI went as far as to pressure various social media platforms to not run the New York Post story on the Hunter Biden laptop. And it was later revealed by Elon Musk releasing some emails that the FBI had paid Twitter at the time, now X, something in the neighborhood of 3.4, 3.5 million to basically do censorship work. So when is it the business of the FBI to suppress damning information on a candidate running for president to the point of actually paying a social media platform millions to suppress stories? And when I guess the payments didn't work, they resorted to pressuring these various social media platforms. I mean, this seems to me outrageous because it can't be described as anything else than the FBI being politicized, the FBI getting involved in the 2020 election. But you tell me, based on your experience with the FBI and what we now know about the Hunter Biden laptop case, how outrageous was it that the FBI got involved in suppressing this story?
Well, it's 2 different things. There definitely was some suppression. This one individual in the Washington field office was allowed to walk out the door, who had slow walked the laptop case. That's one thing. The other thing is, you mentioned, and it's well documented from the so-called Twitter files, that there was an ongoing operation. In fact, the person who had a lot to do with that is going to be shortly or currently giving information to Jim Jordan's House committee that's looking at these matters. But the FBI should never be doing that. The federal government should never be doing that. The First Amendment, principle of the First Amendment, one of the key points is freedom of speech. But the FBI set up a task force. They worked with Twitter and others to monitor speech of American citizens. And it just should never be. And when Wray testified a month ago before the House committee, he was asked about that around the edges, but they never really pinned him down on it. And he said, well, we're looking for, foreign disinformation. But a lot of the posts that they suppressed, we now know from the Twitter files, were posts by Americans. We know in one case, and one congresswoman in particular was really outraged by this, that the Ukrainian intelligence service, which we now know for years had been thoroughly infiltrated by the Russians, the Ukrainian intelligence service had requested the FBI take down certain posts that were up on Twitter, and they did that for the Ukrainian intelligence service, a very questionable organization, and they took down the posts of American citizens. I mean, it's just totally outrageous. And it certainly smacks of violations of the First Amendment. But these are the kind of things for decades in the FBI we're trained to watch out for. Anything touching on the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly even, we were to be very careful about. And there were different guidelines developed about that, and they've been obviously ignored. And once again, I'll say John Durham, who he validated his report, a lot of the stuff that's in my book. John Durham pointed this out, that they have to get back to the original guidelines. They don't need new rules. They just have to follow the guidelines that exist.
There's a question that I've been wanting to ask anybody that's in the FBI or has a connection to the FBI over the years, and this is my first chance to do it. It's a bit off topic with the book, but I want to bring it up, and that is the Perkins Coie law firm. Now, when the issue arose about Barack Obama's birth certificate, a Perkins Coie lawyer named Judith Corley flew to Hawaii to pick it up. Then when there was a press gaggle, as they call them, about the birth certificate, it was Robert Bauer who organized the press gaggle. Hillary Clinton funneled money for the Steele dossier and then listed it as a legal expense for Perkins Coie. Michael Sussman, who is behind the whole Alpha Bank thing, getting that information to the FBI, was with Perkins Coie, and we eventually learned that the FBI at one time even had an office within the Perkins Coie headquarters. Who is Perkins Coie? Why is it that their name comes up again and again and again with a lot of these Democrat scandals? And what exactly is their relationship with the FBI, that the FBI would actually have an office in their headquarters?
There was some explanation given for that, because I think it was a matter that for some reason in some investigation they had a lot of classified documents and they needed somebody there to maintain them or something. Frankly, I don't know the specifics of that or the explanation for it. But Perkins Coie, you're right, was very aligned with the Hillary Clinton campaign. Sussman was from Perkins Coie, and Sussman is the guy who misled the FBI general counsel at the time, whose last name happens to be Baker, the same as mine, no relation. And that was quite deliberate. And once again, that even smacks back to this cultural change that I mentioned at the FBI. Among the other concrete things that Mueller did and Comey followed through on was I mentioned of intelligence analysts. The other thing was the attorneys. In the past, attorneys within the FBI were special agents who were attorneys. What happened under Mueller and Comey, they got rid of all of them, almost all of them, not quite all of them, but they brought in direct hire attorneys who were not special agents. So under William Webster, and other directors earlier, the general counsel of the FBI was a special agent who was an attorney. What happened then under Comey, you have this fellow Baker, I believe it was James Baker, is the general counsel of the FBI, Sussman from Perkins Coie. And of course, these people, they're all in this inner circle in Washington. Trump would call it the deep state. They all know each other. He walks into Baker's office in the FBI headquarters building on the 7th floor, and sits down with the general counsel of the FBI. This is Sussman from Perkins Coie, and he relates another fantastic story, sending them off on a wild goose chase about this bank and this internet connection, and he produces some drummed up stuff about trying to show an internet connection between Trump and Trump's businesses and this Russian bank, which it turns out didn't exist at all, the connections. Anyway, Sussman gets this audience with James Baker. And at the end of it, James Baker tells other people in the FBI, hey, this needs to be looked at, because he's not an investigator. He didn't even know Baker enough to call an FBI agent into the room when Sussman's telling him this stuff, so that it could be committed to an FD 302 and they would have the information down. And of course, a special agent would, we hope, know how to question Sussman and see the holes in his story. But Baker went for it hook, line, and sinker, that Baker. And it's another example of the change in the structure, a specific change in the structure inside the FBI. You have the same thing in Richmond, where the legal counsel for that field office approved this crazy crackpot memo about targeting Catholics. There again, the person wasn't a special agent. The person was the counsel for that office, but not in the past, that would have been a special agent, and we would have hoped they would have been more aware and questioned it, not swallowed this line.
One of the things that I think's been bothering a lot of people are these scenes of what look like SWAT teams or maybe even the military going after someone because of the type of equipment being used when they're being arrested for some type of a nonviolent process crime. I think Roger Stone is probably the best example of that, where he and his elderly wife are in bed and all of a sudden the feds show up and they've got light armored vehicles. There's a frogman coming out of a body of water at the back of their house. You have all this heavy heavy gunnery that's there, and you've got a couple of people that are just laying in bed, being dragged out of bed in their pajamas. I mean, this also strikes me as something that never would have happened in the past. Never in the past would somebody have called CNN and tipped them off, hey, we're gonna put on quite a show over at Stone's house. You're gonna want to be there. Talk to me again about how this plays into the current culture, even though I don't know that those were FBI agents who showed up at Stone's house. But when you see this type of excessive federal force, it's something that makes everyone in society, at least it should make everyone in society, kind of be taken aback by it.
Well, that's the reaction amongst broadly in the former agent community, certainly, and amongst certain people still within the FBI. It's not a good look. In the case of Roger Stone, when that happened, I remember several people who I know personally who had been special agents in charge. They said it's absurd. Often in the past, with white-collar criminals, nonviolent people, and when you know they're represented by an attorney, even when you get an arrest warrant for them, you ask the attorney to bring them in. That's the way things were done. That's not done that way anymore. There is a concern about agent safety. I've always been an advocate of agents always wearing body armor, but the body armor that I'm talking about for men and women can be worn under a shirt, under a vest, under a suit jacket, under a blouse. But these military displays are very off-putting to a lot of the population. One fellow who's I've met and is active in the former agents is Mike Rogers, who for 10 years was a U.S. congressman after he had been an agent for about 10 years from the state of Michigan. And Mike Rogers, even talking to groups of ex-agents, has just said and pleaded with the Bureau, that's not a good look. Rogers has said that people all over the country who otherwise might support the FBI, they're just turned off. One that was really photographed recently was a pro-life individual, I believe in Philadelphia. And once again, it was 8 or 10 people in body armor, helmets and everything, sent with long guns to arrest him at his house. Totally nonviolent individual. These kind of things, there has to be some restraint used. Other people, other critics, law enforcement authorities in America today say this is part of a broader trend of the militarization of law enforcement in America in general, and perhaps it's something we have to step back from. We have to be careful. We don't want law enforcement officers killed or hurt, but there has to be more judgment and discretion used, especially in arresting nonviolent or white-collar criminals. It's absurd. We've seen some of it, and I think Mike Rogers is a good spokesperson to speak out on this. I believe he's going to run for the U.S. Senate now in Michigan, and he has standing to say this, having been an agent himself for 10 years. In fact, I think he was chairman of the Intelligence Committee for a while, that this is just not a good look.
It certainly wasn't to me, and as you said, I think most Americans were put off by it regardless of their political party. Whenever I think about the FBI, I think about a story that a friend of mine told me. He had an uncle that was in the FBI, career man, and he was so proud to be in the FBI, and all his family was proud of him. I mean, I can remember being over at their house one time, and his uncle was there for a holiday, and he said, show Mark your badge, show Mark your badge. I mean, the whole family was just so proud that they had a family member that was in the FBI. This particular individual now does not even tell people he was in the FBI. When people asked him what he did, before retirement, he just says generically, I was in law enforcement, because he is so ashamed of what Mueller and Comey and Wray have done and are doing to the FBI. You've laid out several things that can be done in order for the FBI to return to its glory days, to return to that level of respect, as with this individual's uncle, where people were just proud to be in the FBI and proud to know someone that was in the FBI. But based on what you're seeing right now, sir, do you think it's going to happen? Do you think the FBI will return to being the organization that it once was? Is there a chance that that can happen, or is this just wishful thinking on the part of all of us who would like to see it happen?
I would like to see it happen. I identify with this individual you described. That's essentially my story too. And I've met dozens and dozens and dozens of people who share this view. It's not only, and I wrote the book not only because I feel there's a threat to American liberty, Americans' liberty, but also because my heart is broken. And anybody who reads the book can see that I love the FBI and I loved what it stood for. But there are many people who feel the way I think it can be turned around if the problem is recognized. It's not easy, but it can happen. There are textbooks written in the corporate world about changing culture. It can be done, but the problem has to be recognized. And that was the purpose in my book. I continue to preach this, to bring it up whenever I have the opportunity to deal with FBI executives. I've written a lot of op-eds, as I think you know, in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. I know read by everybody up to and including the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI. Anything that's in the Wall Street Journal is in their morning news summary. I know the issues have been raised, but they still can't seem to get a grip on it. But I still have hope, and maybe it's just hope at this point.
Well, maybe so, but let's hope not. And I can tell you that I read the book, and your love for the FBI and your love for America does shine through very much so. This was not so much, in my opinion, a damning criticism of the FBI as a story of a man who knew what the FBI had been and would like to see it return to that level of respect. One last question for you, sir, and this is a very important one. Mr. Baker, tell people where they can get your book.
Okay, the book, The Fall of the FBI, it's available on Amazon. It's in most Barnes & Noble stores. You can get it online on Barnes & Noble. You can get it online on Amazon. I think Amazon is where most people get their books today. And it's available in hardcover as well as in ebook and Audible. The Fall of the FBI. Please get it and read it.
Yes. I have a long history of sometimes buying books and then not getting to read all of them, and it's something I'm trying to change. But this is one you don't just want to buy, you want to actually read it. There are people who've said that they can't imagine anyone else but you, Mr. Baker, being the person to write this particular book. And after the interview, I can see that they are in fact right. So I want to thank you for being here today. Thank you for giving us your time. And I wish you great success with your book. And I also hope that someone in the right places pays attention to it, and we do see that cultural shift within the FBI so that it can return to the once great agency that it was. Once again, thank you for being here, sir.
And thank you, Mark, for getting and reading the book. And thank you for all the good you do.
I try. The mainstream media isn't really doing what it should. They suppress a lot of stories, and it's kind of interesting that we've gotten to this point that you kind of have to get away from the mainstream media to allow someone to tell their story. So, and we were happy to have you do that today. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Nice talking to you, sir. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.